started in just a moment. Got to tell you guys, no matter what happens tonight, the highlight of my day was at 5:45. I get to go meet with a little guy, actually Charles, my grandson, Walker. And about a year ago, Walker came to me and he said, "Pastor, I am ready to get baptized." And I said, "Okay, we'll see. And y'all, consistently for the next year, Walker's been coming to me and saying, "I'm ready to get baptized. I'm ready to get baptized." And so today we sat down at 5:40 and we talked for about 10 minutes. And y'all, it really is pretty simple, isn't it? We want to make faith so complicated. And as I'm talking to Walker, I said, "So Walker, why do you want to get baptized?" And he said, "Because I know Jesus died for me and I know he loves me." And I said, "That's right, buddy." And boy, we can make faith so complicated. But at the end of the day, if you can confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, welcome to the family. And for a little boy to go, "I know Jesus died for me and he loves me." Yes. And so I walk out and Garrett, his dad, goes, "That's it?" And I go, "Yeah, that's it, man. We're good." It's just a beautiful thing to see. And what'd you say? So Walker's in the 3rd grade, so that would put him, how old's Walker, Charles? 9? Yeah, 9 years oldish. So, and y'all, that's just, what I love is to see just how excited children are to make that profession of faith. And not only to see children, but also to see adults that don't know Jesus come to faith. There's something infectious about the joy that comes with that. And so to me, I think whatever happens the rest of the night, boy, what a good evening I have had. So we're going to continue on tonight, and we are in the 2nd chapter. So we've done introduction, chapter 1, now chapter 2. And again, if you didn't read the book, it's Russell Moore's book that we are going through, where we're looking at losing our religion, an altar call for evangelical Christianity. How can we, in a world of political polarization, in a world of divisiveness, how can the church, and for Russell, it is the evangelical church in particular, how can we maintain an authentic and genuine witness to the gospel? And so that's what I want us to talk about tonight. And the first thing that he says if you didn't read the book, no worries, we're going to give enough of a broad overview, but we have a crisis of truth. We have a crisis of truth. And the subplot of this chapter is how truth can save us from tribalism. Truth can save us from tribalism. And we are in a moment where we have a crisis of truth, and Russell doesn't go into this, but the background is really rooted in the 1960s in really French philosophy, but it becomes known as postmodernism, and this idea that there is no such thing as objective truth. That anyone who says there is in fact a right or a wrong is ultimately making a power play, and that truth is what you define it to be. And that's kind of the philosophical background behind it. But then we now find ourselves in a moment in culture where it is manifest and it's become real in the everyday workings and rhythms of our lives. And it is in particular in religious circles and in political circles. And so 2 examples that to me really kind of frame up for us where we are. One comes from Russell's book and another comes from a friend of mine. And they really, I think, set up for us the broad polarity and the division that we find ourselves in. So if you read Russell's book, you would know the example he uses is from January 6th. And for Russell, it was one of those moments where as he watches what is unfolding at the Capitol on January 6th, he said, "It broke my heart to see what is going on." And Russell digs into the political implications behind it and how so many people felt like the election was stolen, et cetera, et cetera. And y'all, I don't want to get into that space tonight because the real driver for Russell in the breakdown of truth was he said, "I'm watching all of this unfold, And we find ourselves in a moment where there is a makeshift gallows being constructed, and people are chanting to hang Mike Pence because he has forsaken his duty as a vice president. And they are literally constructing a gallows, and people are calling for his execution. That objectively literally happened. You can't ignore it. You can't deny it. It's there. And what Russell says is the most disturbing piece behind all of that is as he's watching the gallows being constructed, what he sees is a sign right beside it that says, Jesus saves. And right beside that is a Confederate flag. And he said, the imagery behind it ultimately points to something that is incredibly destructive and broken in the Christian tradition. Because we should never associate a gallows and a Confederate flag in the same breath as Jesus saves. And so then we move into a different category, because Russell, again, focused on the evangelical world, but I want us to remember this isn't just on one side of a political divide, but it is everywhere and in between. I've got a friend of mine, in June, for those of you that don't know, is LGBTQ Pride Month, and I've got a friend who is very progressive theologically, and he is at a transgender pride parade. And he finds himself as a pastor in this transgendered pride parade, and I will never forget the dichotomy of folks that are dressed up in drag clothes and all of these other things. And there's a moment where my friend is holding a sign where he goes, Jesus loves you just as you are. And y'all, listen, Jesus does love us. Jesus does love us. That's a fact. But just as we are all broken, and we're all sinful people. And so, y'all, while the dichotomy is different, the baseline is the same, that we have lost grip on the centrality of the gospel narrative. And what has happened is truth, because Jesus says, I am the truth, has been hijacked and co-opted for political, social, progressive, conservative agendas. And so what Russell and what I ultimately want us to think about and talk about tonight is, how have we gotten to this place? And if we want to be honest about it, here it's a direct quote from the book where Russell says, we are divided, but not only about what is true, but about what we are allowed to say about the way things ultimately are. Have you heard of cancel culture? Have you heard of cancel culture? Y'all, this is a very real thing. And we find ourselves in an environment where truth, an objective truth, has been rejected. And now people are afraid. And people are scared, both outside of the church and inside of the church, to say things about what is actually happening. Because they're worried that they will be rejected. They're worried. Y'all, I've got friends, pastor friends, that are afraid to talk about divisive issues because conservatives are now being labeled as moderates, and moderates are now being labeled as liberals. And y'all, one of the things that always just baffles me is I am an evangelical. I am someone who believes in the substitutionary atonement and the death of Jesus Christ for the restoration of our souls, and yet people will look at me and say, you're a liberal? Are you insane? Because we dare to question things? This is where we find ourselves. And so, y'all, we have to be honest about the cultural moment we find ourselves in, because Christianity at its core believes in an objective, capital T, truth. But what we find ourselves now in the moment is that truth has been rejected and Christianity has become a prop to hold up different ideas, progressive, conservative, et cetera, et cetera. And so now we're afraid not only to talk about what is true, about what is true. We're divided not only about what is true, but we are divided about what we even think we can say when we talk about what is true. And so, y'all, let's talk about why. Let's talk about why that is the case. And truth has become a tribal identity marker, right? And so we don't talk about objective truth claims anymore, but in the world in which we are living, we now talk about, do you believe what I believe, so that we will know we are on the same team, right? Do you believe that this candidate is wicked? Do you believe that that candidate is wicked? Do you believe that this denomination is lost track of the gospel? Do you believe that that denomination has lost track of the gospel? And we're not talking about truth anymore, but we're talking about tribalistic claims so that we can say who is in and who is out. And that is a dangerous place for us to inhabit culturally, and in particular as a church, right? Because what happens is you become scared to question the orthodoxy of a particular tribe. Because if you do that, then you will be exiled. Let's just bring it boots on the ground for just a moment, right? So our church is this broad tent that I love. And as we are seeking to find an associate pastor, right? We're looking for a new associate pastor, and we are looking in the Southern Baptist Convention, we're looking in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, we're looking in denominations across the board. And what we have begun to find is that we don't fit. We don't fit this category or that category. And so for progressives, we are too conservative. And for conservatives, we're too progressive. And you know what I'm pretty sure of? That means we're doing something right. But y'all, people are increasingly scared to go outside of the boundaries of their tribal identities, because truth has now become so narrowly defined. And in the book, Russell talks so much about that. And people are scared and people are afraid. Barna released some statistics not long ago, Barna, the research group. And one of the things they said is that 42%, I believe, 42% of pastors are currently actively considering quitting their jobs as pastors. And one of the top 3 reasons why is that the church has become too divided over politics. Truth has become a tribal identity marker. And this has devastating impact for the Christian witness. And so what Russell talks about in the book is he says, when this happens, when truth ceases to be an objective thing and when it becomes a marker of, are you part of our team? Or are you part of that team? When that happens is that for so many people, what becomes true is not objective, arguable, analytic thinking, but what becomes true is a willingness for brute strength, a willingness to be mean, a willingness to just exert your ability to brawl on the online square, whether it's on Twitter or social media or even in person. And so this is a direct quote. What becomes the source of authority for too many people is a willingness to brawl and transgress norms in a way that can be absolutely shocking. And so, y'all, what is happening right now is truth has become an identity marker for tribalism. You've got the majority of people that inhabit a center ground, right? But those that are defining the narratives on the right and on the left are the loudest voices in the room, right? And so let's think about our friends on the left. And I want to be careful. I'm using this language on purpose because no one ever, regardless of your political opinion or persuasion, we should ever define them with words like vermin or enemy, because ultimately we are all sinners in need of the grace of God, right? And so our friends that are on the far left that are defining the narrative, as we continue to drive agendas, whether it is, I'm just going to use direct people, right? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or Ilhan Omar, who is in Minneapolis, or fringe voices in the Democratic Party that are defining the narrative because those in the center are unwilling to speak up. Or on the right side of the political aisle, and with people like Madison Cawthon, who lost his primary in North Carolina. And you can go on down the list. Our friend Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is in Dalton, who pushes uber right stuff. And y'all, if I'm stepping on your toes, that's okay. Because I'm not talking about them as human beings, but I'm talking about the loudness of voices and the absence of truth that now allows identities to be defined on how you align with this team or that team. And in the absence of an objective truth, the loudest voices in the room set the agenda. And when that happens, pay close attention, because civility becomes surrender. Empathy is sin. And love of neighbor is ultimately seen as a sign of weakness. And that transcends political parties. It's true of everybody. Y'all, listen, when there was an attempted assassination on former President Trump, and I saw people online that would say vile and wretched things like, boy, I wish they wouldn't have missed. My God, what is wrong with us? And what is true on one side of the aisle is absolutely true on the other. And we have allowed the loudest, in the absence of truth, we've allowed the loudest voices, the most powerful voices, to define the narrative. And we've lost the civility. And it's one thing if we're talking about just culture, but don't forget what we are ultimately concerned about is the church. And the concern that Russell has is that the church has bought wholesale into these same sorts of narratives. And what happens as a result of that really isn't good, because something happens inside of us when the objective is power instead of truth. When the objective is to maintain power, when the objective is to maintain your status as those who are in control, and you don't care about what's true, what's right, and what's wrong anymore, then what Russell talks about in the book, and this is absolutely true, is we are willing to start to tell lies. And we are willing to start to cover up things that ought not be covered up. And y'all, this is where, for Russell, it transcends the political divide. But you look at what happened in the Southern Baptist Church and in the convention, where known sex abusers were covered up. Their abuses were covered up and looked over, because to unmask that would have been damaging to what we're doing. It would have hurt the convention. Do you see what happens when we care more about power than we care about truth? Ultimately, we forsake the gospel. And that is ultimately Russell's concern, y'all. It's been so fascinating to me. And I've actually prayed more about this series than I have about so many things, because I've worried that people are going to walk out of here and go, oh, Will's this party or that party. And I go, I'm not concerned with any of that. I'm concerned about the integrity of the gospel. And when the church forgets that ultimately we care about truth and not about power, then civility becomes surrender, and empathy is sin, and love of neighbor is seen of weakness. And I said to someone one time, and this was before the political drama of our day and the divisiveness, but on the cusp of it, he was talking to me about somebody he hated, and I said, well, Jesus, if I remember correctly, said to love your enemy and pray for those that persecute you. Jesus said, best I can recall, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to them also, right? And y'all, I'll never forget it, because my friend, and he's my friend, he looked at me and he said, well, Will, this is the real world. It's a fundamental betrayal of the gospel, you guys. And we got to pay attention to what is going on. And so we accept things when power is the ultimate goal. We accept things that we know aren't true. And we begin to believe those lies for ourselves. And ultimately, y'all, while it is destructive to the church, I want to remind you it is also destructive to the state of your own soul. And so let's be aware of that. Russell talks a little bit in this chapter about how there's a difference between power and authority. And he says, in the absence of truth, what we have are people who are only concerned with power. He said, but what we need to remember is that there is one who has authority. And authority is something that is earned. It is something that is mutually, it is given. And he talks, for example, about, there are two examples in the book. One about the prophets of Baal who say, hey, pray to Baal and it will rain. And if you don't, destruction will come. And that's power. But authority is, this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he made a covenant with your people. And he loves you and he's for you. You want to give authority to that sort of loving and graceful God. You want to give authority to that sort of person and people. And so he talks about the difference between power and authority with Jesus, right? So the scribes and the Pharisees, they exerted power. If you don't do this, we will punish you. If you do this, we will punish you. But Jesus, I think it's Matthew's gospel says, taught as one who had authority that was given because he told the truth. And he taught with grace and with compassion and with generosity. And what Russell says is we find ourselves living in a world where in the absence of true authority, people are only grasping for power. And I don't actually know what to do about this. Who read chapter 3 or chapter 2? Did anybody read this? Okay. So y'all, there's this interesting moment where Russell talks about the collapse of our institutions. And he goes, the institutions are all just hanging on by a thread right now. And the only reason they're really doing that is because we haven't figured out what we're going to do next. And I found that part to be pretty depressing, actually. Because, y'all, we do find ourselves in a moment where we have respect for our institutions are at the lowest levels they've ever been. And no one is giving authority. And so people are grasping for power. And that is a really bad deal. And it's particularly bad when we talk about the church. Now, someone said to me, it was an Instagram direct message. They said, Will, this isn't the gospel. It's really fascinating because Russell in chapter 2 actually addresses this very thing. He goes, what does this have to do with the gospel? And y'all, please be clear on this. What we are talking about over the course of the next now 4 weeks after this, what does it have to do with the gospel in particular? Let's just be frank. This isn't concerning the nature of the gospel because the crucified and resurrected Christ is still ruling over all of creation no matter what happens over the next election cycle or 10, 20 years down the road, right? This is not about the gospel. But what it is about and why it matters so much, this conversation is about the church's credibility so that we can talk about the gospel. This is about living in a secular world where if we care only about power and we lose track of truth, then we have lost the ability to talk to people about the gospel. And that's the only reason why I want to do this over the course of the next few weeks. It has become very apparent to me that maybe I wish I hadn't done this class. But in reality, I'm really glad I did. Because as we enter into this season, you guys, the witness of the church is so much bigger than the division and the polarization that we find ourselves in this current moment. And please hear me loud and clear with the heart of a pastor saying that the moment we forsake the gospel, trying to cling to power, we might win in the short term, but ultimately we will lose. So please know that something happens inside of us when we seek power instead of truth. And so what do we do? What do we do about this? And Russell spends the majority of the chapter actually talking about this. And you might not be able to read all of this. I'll leave it up so you can take a picture if you want to take notes. But in essence, he gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that we can do individually for the most part. He says, number 1, maintain attention. In the constant bombardment of the news cycle that we find ourselves in, where there's a new thing every single day, it is easy to get weary and it is easy to say, oh, what can I do? You can't change the system on your own. You can't. But you can look after the state of your own heart. And you can make sure that you are committed to following the truth. So maintain attention. You can be awake to what is happening. The second thing that he says is be committed to telling the truth. I love this quote. And this isn't from Russell, it's from another sociologist. He says, to knowingly pretend that a lie is true is simply put, a lie. I go back to, guys, the loudest voices in the room, either on the right side or the left side, are defining the narratives for everyone else. And what happens in this process, and it is true of the church as much as it is true of culture, is that we don't want to be offensive, and we're going to come to this in a few moments, so we just don't say anything. And slowly over time, we begin to echo the sentiments of the loudest voices in the room. And y'all, what happens is that we might not even believe what we're saying, but we say it because we're afraid of what might happen if we tell the truth or if we speak our minds. To knowingly pretend that a lie is true, simply put, is a lie. I love that. And I want to live my life by that. Number 3, avoid foolish controversies. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 23, you guys remember Timothy is a young pastor and Paul is his mentor. And in 2 Timothy, let me find this real quick. Oh, I missed it, so let me back up. This Bible is not my favorite. Yo, where is 2 Timothy? There it is. Did you say after 1 Timothy? Well, thanks, Ronnie. That's real helpful, bud. I appreciate that. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 23. Well, there is no verse 23, so it must be 1 Timothy. Well, okay. Basically, y'all, what it says is avoid foolish controversies because we want to live peaceably with all people. We live in a moment, particularly on social media, where it is everything is the most important thing. And please hear me say this loud and clear, that you do not need to feel obligated to weigh in on every single issue. You don't, because it's not helpful. And I'm talking to you particularly as followers of Jesus. Because, y'all, the world thrives on foolish controversies. Bad news sells. And there's this beautiful moment in here, actually, in the Telling the Truth piece, where Russell talks about how he met with a major player in social media at Facebook, and how they are very clear in how they sell you all of the news you're ingesting. And it's not good news, because good news doesn't draw your attention in. But bad news is what gets that brain pumping and the dopamine hitting, and it draws you in and it gets you addicted. And so they are actively selling us foolish controversies because they know Our reptilian brain will respond to that sort of thing. Do not feel the need to engage in every controversy. When you are at your Thanksgiving dinner table in a couple of months, and I'm looking around the room, and so I think I might be okay in saying it this way. When your hyper-liberal niece comes to the dinner table and is trying to bait you in, don't take the bait, y'all. When your uber-conservative nephew, just to be across the board, wants to talk to you about the latest thing that's happening in the political arena, it's okay to say, I don't want to talk about this because I love you, and there are things that are more important than that, right? Avoid foolish controversies as best you can. Don't self-censor. Don't self-censor. And this is one, guys, that I think is really important. And he says that when we self-censor, which is we don't say things because we don't want to offend anybody. We don't say things because we want to be compassionate, and that can be a good thing. He says, but what happens is if we do that enough, and if we do that often enough, the narrative begins to be defined in counterproductive ways. And he talks about a friend of his who pastored a church, and there was a family in this church that were flat earthers, right? That means the world is flat, not a planet or a globe, right? And what happened was everyone in the church was like, we don't want to be, we're just going to avoid it. We're just not going to talk about it. And over time, they started not preaching on certain topics because the Psalms talk about the pillars of the earth. And what does that say about a flat earth theory? And we don't preach about the sun standing still in Joshua. Because what does that say? And over time, it erodes our ability to have real and substantive conversations in this church. And he goes, it ended up being a real mess. And so y'all, don't self-censor. If you see something that is wrong and you believe something is wrong, it's okay to say it. As one of my mentors told me once, you can disagree without being disagreeable. Isn't that correct? And he also said, you can be right, but if you're a jerk, you're still wrong. Actually, he didn't say jerk. He said another word, but we're in a chapel, and so we're going to move forward from there. Don't self-censor. If you are convictionally believing something is true, it's okay to voice that opinion. And y'all, that doesn't make you a bad person. If you're not going to say something, ask yourself why. Is it out of fear or is it out of love? Because sometimes if it's out of love, it's okay to not say anything. And y'all, the last two things that Russell mentions to me are the most important in the whole. Question authority. That as we move into this fractured and bifurcated culture that we find ourselves in, and the church is tempted to buy into the divisive cultural narratives, we need to question authority. Because, now, this is where we're bringing it full circle, because we are living in a world where there is an absence of objective, capital T, truth, and so everybody is making a play for power. But as followers of Jesus Christ, what we believe is that there is something that is objectively true. There is an authority over our lives. And it begins here. This is the story that defines who we are. It tells us about our place in the universe. And this is the starting place for our authority, but the ultimate authority is the crucified and resurrected Jesus Christ, the one who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the Word who took on flesh and came among us. And so, as we move into these times, question authority. And anytime Anytime we find ourselves in a position where we want to buy into the anger and the vitriol of our age, right? Again, going back to define people as enemies or vermin or wicked, don't you ever forget what Jesus teaches us, right? Pray for your enemies and love those that persecute you. While you were a sinner, Christ died for you. That the human heart is wicked above all things, and that includes not only your enemies, but it includes you yourself. Question any authority that tries to sell you a narrative that is other than that of the Christian gospel. Because that is where we find our true identity. And these are the most important ones for me, right? The others are very practical, but the last two are more kind of existential, philosophical, but they are the root from which the tree ultimately grows. The final thing is inhabit the Bible. I love this, you guys, because what Russell says, and I want to get this quote directly. He says that a friend of his who is a seminary professor says that we now find ourselves in a moment where we have a lot of Bible quoters, but not a lot of Bible readers. That we know a lot of people who can quote random Bible passages to back up their opinion on certain things, but we don't have a lot of Bible readers who find themselves ingratiated and ingrained in the story of God and God's people. We don't need Bible quoters. We need Bible readers. Because when you are a Bible reader, it tells you that you are in fact living in an alternative story that is bigger than the division of our age. That you are defined by the love and grace of Jesus Christ and called by God to extend that out into the world. And doesn't that sound a whole lot better than being this or that political party? Listen, y'all, I'm not telling you that those things aren't important. But what I'm telling you is they're not the most important. Please know that. The heart behind all of this is to say the church is at risk of losing our soul. When we bow down to the altar of power and when we forget what is the ultimate truth, that is Jesus Christ, we run the risk of losing our credibility and not having a truthful and genuine witness to the world that is around us. So, you guys, it's 6:41. I'm going to stop and I'm going to say, does anybody have any questions? Anybody? Well, we figured it all out, haven't we? Oh, you guys. Might I just say how grateful I am to you guys? I'm not kidding you. I got friends that would lose their jobs for getting up and talking about stuff like this. I'm telling you, to be able to come into this space and be reflective and question things that are so divided, it's a gift. And you all are part of what make that happen. So continue to be who you are, because I, for one, am very grateful. Okay, so